Hi, and welcome to an intro to neuroaesthetics. Today we'll be looking at the role of learning in making aesthetic judgments. Basically, how can art training affect the way we judge a work of art to be better or worse than another work of art? For example, look at the following art pieces. How does this make you feel? Do you like this better? Or this? Why? Neuroaesthetics is a relatively new, exciting field of neuroscience that aims to explain visual experience using the biology of the brain. In neuroaesthetics, scientists are devising psychological and neurological experiments to find the neural bases of how we perceive art. What parts of the brain are engaged when we look at art? Where exactly is aesthetic pleasure located? Psychologists have made a distinction between the emotions involved in looking at aesthetics and the cognitive processes involved. The emotional component is important for aesthetic pleasure. You like a painting because it makes you feel happy. The cognitive processes are important for aesthetic appraisal. You judge a painting as superior because of the more intricate execution. In this video, we will canvass some of the work done in neuroaesthetics thus far. Then we'll be looking specifically at some of the experimental and behavioral studies done in the field of aesthetic appraisals. We'll be looking at how learning affects the way a person views art. One prominent neuroaestheticist, Zeki, looks at the parallels between the principles of the brain and the properties of art. Can we break down art the same way that we can break down the visual brain? Zeki seems to think so. In his work, he proposes that the goals of the artist are similar to the goals of the nervous system. Both try to understand essential visual attributes of the world. In the same way that the neural system decomposes visual information into attributes like color, luminance, and motion, artists also isolate and enhance specific attributes of the visual world. In support of this, he brings up the way Matisse uses color and the way Calder uses motion. In the same vein, another researcher named Kavanagh has theorized that the artist is, in a way, a neuroscientist. He proposes that painters reflect perceptual shortcuts already used by our minds. Artists discovered through their art what psychologists call principles of perception. The proof of this can be seen in the way that artists use a kind of alternate physics in their depiction of reality. They bend what is physically possible, presenting impossible transgressions of standard physics. And yet, they do it in a way that viewers don't notice. For example, look at this 1467 painting by Carnivale called The Birth of the Virgin. Do you see anything strange in this painting? Anything that interrupts the way you view it? In actual fact, the light source and the shadows are inconsistent in this painting. Look at the foreground. All the figures have very long shadows. In the background, if you look up the steps and to your left, the characters there don't have any shadows at all. This is an inconsistency that the viewer doesn't notice at once and doesn't actually change the way they view the painting. They can still see it as a representation of reality. Furthermore, some artists hint at elements without finishing the contours in the artworks. Oftentimes, they use colors to convey emotional content. They use flat images to represent 3D reality. All in all, Kavanagh proposes that these shortcuts taken by artists reveal the way that the brain processes visual information. He says, paintings and drawings are a 40,000-year record of experiments in visual neuroscience. Ramachandran and Herstein, in their research, utilize an important concept from our learning and plasticity course. The peak shift effect is observed during discrimination studies. Specifically, it occurs when a subject has been taught to discriminate between a reinforced stimulus and a non-reinforced stimulus. In the trials that follow, the trend of responses of the experimental animals shift away from the non-reinforced stimulus. This is known as the peak shift effect. Ramachandran and Herstein utilize this phenomenon in explaining the way people react to abstract art forms. They propose that humans have neural structures that have evolved to respond to specific visual stimuli in their environment. These same neural structures respond more actively, then, to underlying primitives of that form, simplified versions of those visual stimuli. These visual primitives are used by artists purposefully in abstract art. This might explain, then, in part, the aesthetic pleasure we receive from viewing abstract art. Though intellectually stimulating, these theories are quite controversial. The experience of visual aesthetics is just so complex. How can it be possible to define art neurologically? Nevertheless, there are good reasons to conduct experimental studies on the experience of art. Using new technologies, researchers can begin to study facets of aesthetic experience. For example, there are the visual processes involved in looking at art, the emotion involved, the empathetic motor response, and the preference for beauty. Researchers can also determine what factors are involved when people make aesthetic judgments. We'll talk more on this in our second video. Thanks for joining us today.